chap up in the other room. Well, good morning. There are some Sisters of St. Joseph before me from Rochester, New York. I am Sister Mary Lou Mitchell, and I was asked this morning to speak on the role of contemplation in the midst of leadership. And so that will be our topic, and I deeply appreciate the sisters here to listen to me. I'd like to start by sharing a little story. About 25 years ago, when I was working on my dissertation, I found that the practice of mindfulness, of learning to live in the present moment, was a wonderful technique to help people with high blood pressure lower their pressure. And the reason I found this to be helpful was that I taught clients to use their breath to calm down. The breath is something that's with us all the time. We go everywhere with our breath. And so what I did was helped individuals come to know that when they were anxious or stressed, they moved into a breathing exercise and they let themselves be in the moment. Now I have to confess, after 6 months of teaching this, I thought I was an expert. I thought, oh, I have mindfulness down pat. I have living in the present moment down pat. And then I walked my sister into the University of Rochester with ovarian cancer. And I looked up at the motto over the door at the University of Rochester, which is knowledge is power. And I thought to myself, I had a lot of knowledge, but I was not sure I had a lot of power. And so after my sister recovered from her ovarian cancer, I went back to the practice of mindfulness. And I began to really try to learn what that practice was from my heart. And so the Buddhists will say we live in the present moment and that we need to live here non-judgmentally. And the way to do that is to be aware of our thoughts, our feelings, our judgments, and our attitudes, and not allow those to control our direct experience of life. Now, as I grew in my mindfulness practice, what I recognized was that it wasn't enough for me. That every time I was in the present moment, what I felt like was that the presence of God was also here. And so I began to study James Finley and Thomas Merton. And that helped me to see that in each moment, as it is the presence of God, if we have the eyes to see. If we are allowing ourselves to be in the moment as it is. And so I became a student of contemplation. And what I can tell you is I will always be a student. I believe that Thomas Merton was correct when he said, in this very moment, the ground on which we stand is sacred. If we have the eyes to see. Now, when I started in leadership in the congregation, I told myself that I needed to bring my practice with me because I believe that you need it in everything you do. However, I have to confess that it was only about 3 years ago that it really struck me how important contemplation is as a daily practice in leadership. And it was when I was listening to a tape by Richard Rohr. And Richard said that Jesus was the expert in contemplation. That Jesus was able to live always in the midst of contradictions and struggles without ever being caught up in them. And I thought to myself, contradictions, struggles, differences. If you're in leadership of any type, you begin to recognize that you're constantly coming in and interacting with differences of all types. You're also continually meeting contradictions. And so what Richard said, and it went really back to this whole idea of the Buddha's practice of mindfulness, which makes sense, is that Jesus was raised in the Eastern tradition. And in the Eastern tradition of learning how to see, you see in wholes. You don't see in parts. In our Western model, it's always breaking everything down. Good, bad, different, separate, distinct. And yet Jesus was taught to always hold the situation as it is and as it was, without judging it, without trying to see whether he liked it or didn't like it. He let himself be with his reality. And so, as I have these last few years tried, whenever I am in any situation, I invite myself to do a very simple practice. I take a breath. And as I breathe in and breathe out, I invite myself into this moment. The moment is the only moment I have. There's no guarantee of any other moment by this one. And then as I am in the moment, and I could be with many other people, I could be with one person, or I could simply be with an issue that is before me. I try to become aware of my thoughts, my feelings, my judgments, my attitudes, and I acknowledge them. Reality is we can never stop our thinking, nor can we ever stop feeling. And many times, it takes a long time before we recognize that we judge everything. Many times even before we realize that we've judged something. And so the practice of contemplation is allowing myself to be in the moment and to recognize, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? How am I judging this? And then asking for the grace to let it go and to let myself be in the experience, to let myself directly experience it. Now, Richard Rohr's point is that if you're going to be a contemplative in today's world, you have to be willing to live in unknowing, to be willing to drop below the surface of things and to see deeper. And it takes time. When I think of how Jesus struggled with the Pharisees and he struggled with all the critics, he never fought with them. He engaged them. He engaged them and he tried to bring them to a deeper level of seeing as he saw. From my experience in religious leadership, the struggle is always when there are differences, is to hold the tension between the opposites till we can get underneath and see where there's truly a connection, to see truly where the differences up here may be different, but there's a unity underneath. It's messy, it's challenging, and from my experience, it takes regular disciplined practice of letting myself be in the moment without judgment. I personally find that I need at least 20 to 30 minutes a day of sitting still and letting myself be with my world as it is. If you think about a flower, there's a beautiful yellow rose. The rose stays fresh by staying in water. The rose stays full of life by staying within its situation. We're called, I believe, to stay contemplative at all times. And there is no way to do it than to let ourselves be in to let ourselves be still. When I sit each morning, and sometimes in the evenings, though I have to confess, you can go to sleep in the evening more often than I do in the morning. As Thomas Merton and James Finley have said, you let yourself sit, you let yourself breathe, and you let yourself be with your world as it is in the moment. Now, as soon as I say to myself, I'm going to let myself be with my world as it is in this moment, I immediately start to analyze. I immediately start to feel. I can feel dread, I can feel anxiety, I can feel joy, I can feel whatever. And I can also begin to try to figure out the situation. And that's when I have to say, Mary Lou, you have to let it go. You have to hold the situation as it is and let yourself be with it. Let yourself directly experience it. Several years ago, I was giving myself a little lecture on this, and I got in the car on a cold, wintry night, and I immediately said, as I sat in the car and it was freezing, I hate winter. I hate winter. And a little voice said, hey, weren't you the one that was constantly saying directly experience life? Don't judge it? And I thought, have I ever allowed myself to directly experience winter without judgment? I learned more about what it means to be patient. I learned more about stillness in the midst of a cold winter morning. I also began to believe more deeply in a way I can't explain in hope, knowing that underneath all the snow and the cold, there was still life. And so my letting myself be with winter helped me grow in what it means to be. As a member of a religious congregation, while in leadership, I've had the privilege of being with sisters in their final days and hours, watching them breathe in and breathe out the life that they have in this moment, and then watching when they give over their last breath, and the stillness where there is not life, and yet there is, because of our belief in the resurrection. Helen Keller said, that which is essential is invisible to the eye. It can only be seen with the heart. I believe that as we practice contemplation, we're learning to see with our hearts. We're learning to experience life with our hearts. And we're learning how to live in conflict and tension in a nonviolent way. Because we keep trying to be with the reality until something new comes up and arises. A year ago or so, we were having a very intense congregational day. And there was unhappiness in the room, there was struggle in the room, there was conflict in the room. I'm sure some of you have had that similar experience. We were doing a PowerPoint presentation, and a slide came up. And I cannot tell you what the slide said, but when we went to questions and answers, a sister got up and said, if we go back to this slide, I think you're going to see that it's written in a very judgmental way. It's written in a harsh approach. Now, I could sense in me a resistance coming up. It was like, wait a second, that statement was not defensive. And then this voice, which I believe comes from the practice of contemplation, said to me, Mary Lou, invite in that sister's statement. Hold what she is saying for a few minutes and let yourself be with it. Hold it and let it inform you in terms of your ability to see. I went over to the slide, I read it again, and I realized it could have been interpreted in that fashion. And so I quickly changed it. And at the end of our break, I said to the community, so-and-so had a point. And as I've looked at the statement, I've tried to make it more open-ended and hopefully less judgmental. And the sisters could read it, and it did make sense. 48 hours later, I was taking a walk, and a sister stopped me. And she said to me, "Thank you." And I said, "For what?" And she said, "You modeled an openness, a vulnerability, by being able to see what that sister was saying and being willing to change in light of what you heard." And I said to her, that comes through a practice of letting myself be with what is, as it is, without judgment. And that's what I continually having to learn in my daily life. When I encounter anyone, am I experiencing them as they are and who they are? And am I allowing myself to be with them and letting them be who they are and I can be who I am? It's challenging. That's why when you sit for 20 minutes to a half an hour and you begin to experience feelings, you let yourself be with the feelings that come up. My mother died a few months ago, so sometimes when I do my mindfulness practice, grief rises up. A tremendous sadness is suddenly within my heart. What I have learned is that if I hold the feeling, if I let myself be with it fully, feelings have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They go away. Sometimes they don't go away as fast as I would like them to go away, but they do go. Have you ever been annoyed or angry or upset with somebody and you want to react? What Thomas Merton, James Finley, Thich Nhat Hanh, all of the great experts in this will say, stop. You have to stop. You have to let yourself be with whatever it is that's there, the anger, the frustration. And you have to let yourselves become still. For 25 years, when I am most upset, I carry a sentence by Thich Nhat Hanh. If you want to understand something, if you want to see, you need to learn to be still. Stillness is the foundation of all understanding and insight. So if you want to understand, if you want to see, you have to learn to be still. Because it is in stillness that you can truly see the world as it is. And I believe find the sacredness of God. Find the presence of God in the situation. I have a wonderful spiritual guide who one day when I was talking about feelings and thoughts and judgments and I was kind of frustrated with myself because I didn't seem to think I could ever get into a stillness. She read me this wonderful poem by Rumi. It's called The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He or she may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. And so, how do we welcome in that which is before us? There's John O'Donohue used to say, can you bring everyone into your hearth? Can you bring everyone into your inner fire and let them be? And so, not only do we need to greet and welcome our own thoughts and our own feelings, but we also have to welcome in the thoughts and feelings of others, and how hard that is to do. I believe it's only possible when we allow ourselves to be known in who we are, and allow ourselves to be in our inner sanctum with God, and know how much we're loved as we are. And the more we can love ourselves as we are, the more when others come that are very different, we can be with them and be present to who they are. I was really challenged when Pat Farrell, in writing about the whole LCWR investigation, when she said this: what if transformation most frequently happens when differences come into uncomfortable contact with each other? What if the encounters that disturb and confuse us are privileged pathways to a new consciousness otherwise difficult to access? And so, for me, Pat's question is, I think, essential in the 21st century. Differences abound in religious life in the world. Liberals, conservatives. Just think of all the polarities that exist. And when do we bring them close enough to let them be with each other so that we can fall into a deeper understanding of what life is really all about? The unity that does exist underneath. As Sisters of St. Joseph, we believe in unity, that all may be one. How do we live that? My sense is through contemplation. My practice of trying always to allow myself to be in this moment, to allow myself to see myself as well as the other, and to let us encounter each other. Do we do it perfectly? No. Do we make mistakes? Yes. Do we have to keep inviting in that guest that we were hoping was not going to come? Impatience, frustration, peace. But it starts with the breath. I'm going to invite each of you to just let yourselves breathe in through your mouth or your nose, and then breathe back out. Just breathe in and breathe out. And let yourself be aware of your body on the chair. Experience the fact the sacredness of this moment. And as you breathe in and breathe out, if you become aware of thoughts and feelings, acknowledge them. And then just let yourself gently move back to your breath. We're just letting ourselves be. Be in this moment as it is. Without judgment. Knowing in our heart of hearts that God is present within us and among us. Stillness can always be found if we let ourselves be. I'm going to invite you to bring your awareness back into this chapel. Some experts say that a wonderful practice is to stop every hour on the hour and to let yourselves be, to breathe in and breathe out, and to ask yourself, where are you? And if you're here, say, invite yourself here. I actually did some research about 25 years ago, and at that point, what the research showed is that most of us spend 50% of our time in the past, 40% of the time in the future, and only 10% of the time in the present moment. And then there was actually research that said, and most of the time when we're in the present moment, that 10%, we're thinking negative thoughts. We're thinking about what could go wrong. Thinking about whatever, and not recognizing that our thinking is controlling us. Our feelings could be controlling us. And we aren't getting to the deeper reality of the life. One of my favorite authors is Mary Oliver. I find that if I'm struggling with calling myself into the reality of being in the moment, one of her poems, many poems, helps me. And so I'd like to share this one with you. Where does the temple begin? Where does it end? There are things you can't reach, but you can reach out to them, and all day long. The wind, the bird flying away, the idea of God. And it can keep you as busy as anything else, and happier. The snake slides away, the fish jumps like a little lily, out of the water and back in. The goldfinches sing from the unreachable top of the tree. I look morning to night. I am never done Looking, I mean not just standing around, but standing around as though with your arms open. And thinking maybe something will come. Some shining coil of wind, or a few leaves from an old tree. They are all in this too. And now I will tell you the truth. Everything in the world comes at least closer and cordially, like the nibbling, tinsel-eyed fish, the unlooping snake, like goldfinches, like dolls of gold, fluttering around the corner of the sky. Of God, the blue air. I love the image of the open arms. And I do believe if we're going to be contemplatives in action, this is how we move through life, with open arms, willing to take in that which is before us, willing to directly experience it, willing to try to be with it. I believe Jesus is a wonderful model, and I believe Scripture is a wonderful way to help us let ourselves be as he was, to see as he saw in today's world, in the experience of today. But there's no pass on how to do it. It's practice. I can remember a few years ago, my mother attended one of my classes on the practice of mindfulness, and I was going over different mantras. And when we got all done, on the way home, I said to my mother, "Did you like my talk?" She said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "Well, did you learn anything?" She said, "No." I said, "Well, what did you think?" "Oh," she said, "Mary Lou, I've been doing this for years. I use my rosary. My rosary is my practice of what you call mindfulness or contemplation. When I get really nervous or upset, I go to my rosary and I get calm and I get still, and eventually I get to see differently." So you're right, you do see differently. So yeah, it was interesting. Mother's had such a wonderful way of helping us keep things in perspective. And so, I have been talking for a little over a half hour. Anybody have any question? I have about 15 sisters in front of me. Those of you who are watching this on tape, wonderful faces. One of the sisters said in Richard Rohr's book, he talks about the importance of living in the tension. And I think that is true. We spend days living in the tension, of holding the tension until a third way can be found, till we discover where the unity lies. And see, in our Western culture, we're not used to letting ourselves be confused. We're not used to letting ourselves know that an answer's not going to come immediately. And that's the holding the tension, is the wonderful Eastern saying, can you wait until the mud settles and the right action rises in and of itself? So wonderful. Can you wait until the mud settles? until the right action rises in and of itself. I was giving a retreat one time, and I said to the group, okay, we're going to do a jar with water and dirt. I shook it up, and so I said the same. Can you wait until the mud settles and the right action rises in and of itself? I should have done it before I did it with this group, because we sat for an hour, and I thought, in my Western mind, an hour's time, the dirt would be settled and there'd be clarity. We would see what to do. That retreat went 5 days, and the clarity of the water, it really took the entire 5 days. And what I realized is sometimes it takes a long time to hold the tension, to hold the differences, until really we can see what we need to do next. And I think in leadership, that's always a struggle, to not rush to an answer, to not rush to a decision, until we really have a sense that this is what we're called to do. So it's a being before doing. Our culture likes it like that. And so that holding the tension, holding the differences. Carl Jung would say, if we hold it long enough, the transcendent function will arise. The presence of God will arise. I love that idea of the transcendent happens in the midst of differences. One of the sisters in the audience asked, I've been talking about it from an individual leader perspective, how do we help a group or a community grow in being contemplative in actions? And I believe that that is the primary principles around communal discernment and helping individuals become comfortable in communal discernment. But it starts with each sister being aware from her own ability to be a contemplative, to be still, and then teaching the group to also do it in a communal format. I also think that it's learning new ways of deep listening to one another, so that in a community setting, when there is conflict or differences, it's learning approaches to be able to stay in conversation, to stay in dialogue with one another. The Quakers have probably one of the soundest approaches to this, by their ability to stay in a circle and to never try to convince the other person of their position, but to always speak their truth to the center of the circle. And that everyone listens to that truth. They don't take it on if they don't necessarily believe, but they hold it. And then when they're ready to speak their truth, they also speak to the center of the circle. And that it takes time for what the Quakers will say to shake with the reality that they all hold the same truth. And it was shaped by the conversation. It was shaped by the dialogue. And so I think as communities, as we grow in that type of conversation, where we really do reverence and respect listening to each person's truth and honoring it, we discover the bigger truth, or we discover the new insight. And so this practice of being a contemplative in action can be used by a whole group. And I think that's where we're growing in that as religious congregations and being able to do that. And just think if our government could ever learn to have those types of conversations. But I'd have to say Parker Palmer and his whole approach to struggling with an issue within a circle and really letting the circle hold the tension until they can come to a new insight. He tells the story, and this is how I can close, is he said they were in a Quaker circle and they were having a great conflict about some issue. And he said at the end of their prayer meeting, it had not been resolved. So he said all week they all struggled with it in their own lives. And when they came back the next Saturday for their prayer meeting, the leader said, okay, in light of the conflict going on in this group, I've decided that we are going to sit today. And usually they said for 10 minutes. He said, however, in light of the conflict, we are going to sit for a half hour before we start our conversation and listening to one another. And the point was, the greater the struggle, the longer the time of stillness is needed before we can begin to really listen to ourselves and listen to one another. So it is the deep listening without judgment and letting God reveal what God is meant to reveal. And so I want to thank you for joining me near and far, and to say that stillness always speaks of God's presence, and that may our hearts lead us always to that being with the presence of God who is always here. Thank you. Thank you very much.